The ugliest house on Winslow Street stood before me, its broken windows staring back like hollow eyes that had seen too much and given up on seeing anything more. Paint peeled from the walls in long strips that curled away like dead skin, shedding from a body that no longer cared to hold itself together. The roof sagged in the middle, exhausted from decades of holding itself up against storms and seasons and the slow, relentless weight of time. Weeds had claimed the yard so completely that the porch steps had nearly disappeared beneath them, swallowed by green that no one had bothered to cut back in years. My hand trembled slightly as I signed the paper. $3. That was all this place cost. That was all I had left to give. At 54 years old, after 32 years of marriage, everything I owned fit into a single suitcase sitting in the trunk of my car. This crumbling shell of a building that no one else wanted was about to become the only thing in the world that truly belonged to me. The pen felt heavy in my fingers as I wrote my name on the line, each letter a small act of defiance against everything that had brought me to this moment. But standing there on that overgrown sidewalk with the autumn wind picking up and the smell of dead leaves mixing with something older and mustier coming from the house itself, I did not know yet what secrets lay hidden beneath those rotting floors. I did not know that this forgotten wreck, this place that three other buyers had fled from in fear and failure, would change everything I had lost. Because only 3 weeks earlier, my life had been something else entirely. The office had beige walls and a clock that ticked too loudly, each second marking time that suddenly felt like it was running out. Gordon sat across from me in a leather chair, his hands folded on the mahogany desk between us, his expression calm in a way that felt rehearsed. After 32 years of marriage, every line on his face was as familiar to me as my own reflection. Every shift in his posture, every tone his voice could take, the way his jaw tightened when he was lying about something small, the way his eyes softened when he was about to deliver bad news he actually felt sorry about. But this version of him was someone I had never seen before. His explanation came quietly, methodically, as if he were discussing a business transaction with a client rather than the dissolution of our entire life together. The words floated through the air between us, landing one by one like stones dropped into still water, each one sending ripples that disturbed everything around it. Divorce, settlement, division of assets. The paperwork was already prepared. Every document printed and organized in neat stacks that spoke of weeks, maybe months, of planning. Every signature line waiting for my hand. As my fingers flipped through the pages, trembling slightly against the expensive paper, understanding began to dawn like a slow and terrible sunrise. This was not sudden. This was not a decision made in the heat of an argument or the aftermath of some terrible fight that had pushed him over the edge. There had been no screaming match the night before, no thrown dishes or slammed doors, no affair discovered or secret revealed. This had been planned, carefully, deliberately. Constructed behind my back with the precision of an architect designing a building, every detail accounted for, every contingency considered, while I continued living the same ordinary days I had always lived. Making dinners that he ate without comment, running the antique shop I believed we owned together, arranging vintage furniture and pricing old jewelry, and greeting customers who became friends over the years. Trusting, with the complete and foolish faith of someone who had never been given a reason to doubt, that the life I saw was the life that existed. The house, I discovered as I read through the documents, had always been in his name alone. The deed that I had never thought to examine listed only Gordon Ashford as owner. The home where I had raised our daughter, where I had painted the walls and chosen the curtains and planted roses in the backyard, belonged to me in no legal sense at all. The business I had built over 28 years, the antique shop that had started as a small booth at a flea market and grown into a respected establishment that people drove hours to visit, was legally his name on the business license, his signature on the lease. My sweat and my vision and my decades of work reduced to something that could be signed away without my consent. The savings accounts had been restructured months ago, moved beyond my reach without my knowledge, transferred into new accounts that bore only his name. The retirement funds we had discussed so many times, planning trips we would take and grandchildren we would spoil. now existed in a form I could not touch. Even the investments I thought were our safety net, the stocks and bonds we had built up over years of careful saving, had been quietly transferred into accounts I could not access. Every door I might have walked through to rebuild my life had been locked before I even knew I needed to escape. My eyes lifted from the papers, searching his face for something. Anything. Regret or guilt, or even a flicker of hesitation that would tell me the man I had shared my life with still existed somewhere behind that careful mask. Some sign that this was difficult for him too. That 32 years meant something that could not be calculated in dollars and percentages. Gordon simply met my gaze with those familiar blue eyes and spoke the words that landed heavier than any argument we had ever had, heavier than the worst fight we had weathered in 3 decades of marriage. I made the money, Vivian. You just helped. Silence filled the room like water filling a sinking ship. The clock continued ticking, indifferent to the destruction happening beneath its steady rhythm. Somewhere outside the window, a car door slammed and an engine started, and someone drove away to continue their ordinary day. Those words did not just dismiss my place in the present. They erased my entire past. 32 years of shared effort, of building something together brick by brick and day by day, of believing I was a partner rather than an assistant following orders. All of it reduced to something small, something dismissible, something that did not count and never had. I thought about the nights I had stayed late at the shop, researching the history of a piece so I could price it fairly. The weekends I had spent driving to estate sales 3 states away, hunting for inventory that would draw customers through our doors. The relationships I had built with dealers and collectors, the reputation I had created through years of honest dealing and genuine expertise, the knowledge I had accumulated about furniture styles and pottery marks and jewelry hallmarks, knowledge that lived in my head and had made our business what it was. All of it reduced to helped. No argument came from my lips, not because I agreed with what he was saying, but because the realization arrived too quickly, too completely, leaving no space for denial or negotiation. Only a hollow clarity that everything I thought was secure, everything I had believed was built on solid ground, had been resting on a foundation that was never truly mine. Our daughter Celia stood in the doorway of the office, 29 years old, with her father's blue eyes and her father's certainty, and the expensive blazer she wore to her marketing job in the city. My heart reached toward her, waiting for some sign that this felt wrong to her too, that she would question what was happening, that the bond between mother and daughter, the connection we had built through bedtime stories and scraped knees and heart-to-heart talks about boys and dreams and fears, still meant something that could not be divided up in a divorce settlement. But she only looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. Pity, maybe, the way you might pity a stranger who had fallen on hard times. Or discomfort, the awkwardness of being present for something unpleasant that you wished would just be over. Or simply the desire to be somewhere else, anywhere else, rather than standing in this room watching her mother's world collapse. "Mom," she said quietly, and her voice carried no warmth, no reassurance, nothing that sounded like the girl who used to climb into my lap and tell me I was the best mother in the whole wide world. "Maybe this is for the best. You can start fresh. Start fresh." As if I were a whiteboard that could simply be wiped clean with a damp cloth. As if 54 years of life and 32 years of marriage could be erased and rewritten with a few words of encouragement and a positive attitude. The suitcase I packed was small. There was not much to take that was truly mine. Not much that Gordon's lawyers had not already claimed, or that I could prove belonged to me rather than to us, which meant to him. Some clothes that I had bought with money from our joint account, which was no longer joint. A few personal items that held more memory than monetary value. A locket my mother had given me, a scarf I had bought on our 20th anniversary trip to Paris, photographs of Celia as a baby that I slipped into my purse like contraband. The front door of the house I had lived in for 3 decades closed behind me with a soft click, a sound so small and ordinary that it seemed impossible it could mark the end of everything. I stood on the porch where I had watched Celia ride her first bicycle, where I had kissed Gordon goodbye on countless mornings, where I had sat on summer evenings drinking lemonade and believing that this was my life, my home, my place in the world. Now it was just a house that belonged to someone else, and I was just a woman standing on the sidewalk with a suitcase, not knowing where she would go next. The silence that followed was different from anything I had known. Not peaceful, like the quiet of a Sunday morning or a walk in the woods. Not restful, like the stillness before sleep, but empty, completely and terrifyingly empty. Like a room where all the furniture had been removed and only the echoes remained, bouncing off bare walls that had nothing left to absorb them. Temporary places became my life in the weeks that followed. Cheap motels with thin walls where strangers coughed through the night and televisions blared through the shared spaces, and the smell of industrial cleaner never quite masked the smell of all the desperate people who had passed through before me. Spare rooms offered by acquaintances who did not quite know what to say, who made awkward small talk over breakfast and left pamphlets about divorce support groups on my nightstand, and seemed relieved when I mentioned I would be moving on soon. Each location served as a reminder that I no longer belonged anywhere, that the life I had built, the identity I had constructed around being Gordon's wife and Celia's mother and the owner of the antique shop on Main Street, had been quietly dismantled while I was still living inside it. I was homeless in a way that went deeper than not having a roof over my head. I was unmoored, untethered, floating through days that had no structure and nights that had no rest. Mirrors became something to avoid, not because of the gray in my hair that had spread further in recent weeks, or the lines around my eyes that seemed deeper than they had been a month ago, but because I no longer recognized the life reflected behind me. Every time I caught my own gaze in a bathroom mirror or a store window, I saw a stranger looking back. A woman whose history had been erased without her permission. A woman whose life, it turned out, had never really been hers to claim. And yet beneath the confusion and the quiet humiliation that colored every interaction, every pitying glance from people who had heard what happened, something else was forming. Something that could not quite be named at first. Not anger, though anger lived in there somewhere, buried deep and waiting for its moment. Not even sadness, though sadness was the water I swam in every day, the air I breathed every night. But a slow, steady awareness that I had been left with nothing, not because I had nothing to give, but because everything had been taken without my noticing. I had not failed. I had been robbed. And there was a difference between those two things that mattered more than I could articulate yet. It was on one of those aimless afternoons, walking without direction just to fill the hours that stretched empty before me, that my feet stopped in front of a small office window on a side street I had never noticed before. The window was cluttered with outdated notices and fading advertisements, the kind of haphazard display that suggested no one had updated it in months or maybe years. Help wanted signs for jobs that had probably been filled long ago. Notices about community events that had already passed. Business cards for services no one had called about in ages. My eyes drifted over the usual listings without much interest. Rooms for rent that I could not afford. Second-hand furniture that I had no place to put. Part-time jobs for people who needed to fill their days with something other than silence and regret. And then one line caught my attention. Typed on a yellowed index card that had been pinned to the board so long ago that the pushpin had rusted. Property for sale, $3. The number could not be right. My eyes must be playing tricks on me, filling in digits that were not there or missing ones that were. There had to be a missing zero somewhere, or a decimal point that made the price 300 or 3,000. Some hidden condition or catch or explanation for the absurdity of a property being sold for less than a cup of coffee. But no matter how long I stared at that faded index card, the number remained the same, small and almost meaningless, as if the property itself had been reduced to something no one valued enough to price properly, as if someone had simply given up on it and written down the smallest number that still qualified as a sale. The door opened before I could talk myself out of entering. A small bell chimed overhead, announcing my presence to an office that smelled of old coffee and older paper, of dust that had been settling for decades and air freshener that had given up trying to mask it. An older man sat behind a cluttered desk, reading glasses perched on his nose, a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago sitting beside his elbow. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie loosened, his gray hair in need of a trim. He looked like someone who had been doing this job for 40 years and had stopped caring about appearances somewhere around year 15. His eyes lifted when I approached, his expression neither welcoming nor dismissive. Just tired. The kind of tired that comes from seeing too many people walk through that door looking for something they probably would not find, hoping for miracles in a world that had run out of them long ago. The listing in the window, I said, pointing toward the glass behind me. The property for $3. Is that real? He studied me for a moment, as if deciding whether I was worth the effort of an explanation. Whether I was another time waster who would ask questions and never follow through, or whether there was something different about me, something that might make me stay where others had fled. Then his hand reached into a drawer and pulled out a piece of paper with an address scribbled across it in handwriting that tilted slightly to the left. The kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who had written the same address many times before. "It is real," he said, his voice carrying the weight of too many cigarettes and too many years. "But you should see it first before you get any ideas." Something in his tone made me hesitate. Not a warning exactly, but something close enough to give pause before taking the paper from his weathered hand. "What is wrong with it?" He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him like old bones protesting movement. The previous owner lived there alone for most of her life. Harriet Colvin. Good woman from what people say, kept to herself mostly, but good. She passed about 2 years ago. Suddenly, one of those hearts that just stops beating without any warning or explanation. He paused to take a sip of his cold coffee, grimacing at the taste but drinking it anyway. No family came forward to claim the property. No children, no siblings, no cousins twice removed looking for an inheritance. Legal disputes tied the place up for a while, different agencies arguing about who was responsible for what, and by the time everything got sorted out, nobody wanted to touch it. Why not? A shrug lifted his thin shoulders, but something else lurked in his eyes. Something he was not saying, something he had seen or heard that made him hesitate to speak directly. "Some places just get a reputation," he said finally, choosing his words with care. "3 buyers before you, all of them eager to snap up a bargain, all of them convinced they had found the deal of a lifetime. First one had his business fall apart within a month of signing the papers. Lost everything, had to declare bankruptcy, moved to another state to start over. Second one, her marriage ended. Husband left her for someone younger, took the kids. The whole ugly story. She said the house had cursed her, that she could feel something wrong in the walls." He paused again, and this time the silence stretched longer. Third one, well, he did not last long enough to move in. What happened to him? Heart attack, 62 years old, seemed healthy as a horse, had plans to renovate the place and flip it for a profit. Dropped dead in the front yard before he even got the key in the door. Paramedics said he was gone before he hit the ground. The sensible thing would have been to walk away, to set the paper down on his cluttered desk and thank him for his time and go back to my motel room to figure out some other plan, any other plan, for what to do with the rest of my life. But something about the story stayed with me, like a song you cannot stop humming even when you have forgotten the words. Not the warnings, not the superstition about curses and bad luck and hearts that stop beating for no reason, but the woman, Harriet Colvin, who had lived alone in that house for most of her life, who had died alone, with no family to claim her belongings or mourn her passing or carry her memory forward, who had been forgotten by everyone except the people who blamed her house for their own misfortunes. There was something in her story that felt familiar, something that resonated with the hollow place inside me where my own identity used to live. "I will take a look," I said, and the words came out before I could stop them, before the sensible part of my brain could raise its objections and list all the reasons this was a terrible idea. The address led to a quiet street on the edge of town, far from the commercial center and the neat subdivisions where families lived their orderly lives. Winslow Street. The name sounded old-fashioned, like something from another era when streets were named after the people who built them, rather than developers looking for something that would sell. Houses stood in varying states of care along both sides of the cracked pavement. Some were well kept, with flower boxes in the windows overflowing with autumn mums, fresh paint on the shutters, lawns that had been raked clear of leaves and trimmed with precision. Others showed signs of age and neglect, their lawns overgrown with weeds, their porches sagging under the weight of years, their windows dark and blank like eyes that had stopped looking out at the world. But none of them looked quite like number 47, the ugliest house on the street. It stood apart from its neighbors in a way that made it impossible to miss, even among the other neglected properties. The paint was peeling in long strips that curled away from the wood, like skin sloughing off a body in decay. The windows were dark and cracked, some of them boarded over with plywood that had warped and buckled in the rain and snow of seasons past. The roof sagged in the middle as if it had grown tired of holding itself together, tired of fighting gravity, tired of pretending to be something that people might want to live under. The yard had been consumed by weeds so completely that the porch steps had nearly vanished into the green tangle. Bushes that might once have been decorative had grown wild and shapeless, their branches reaching out like grasping hands. A fence that had once marked the property line had collapsed in sections, its posts leaning at angles that defied physics, held up only by the vines that had wrapped around them. My feet stopped at the edge of the property, and I stood there taking it in. The afternoon light was fading toward evening, casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn, making the house look even more abandoned and forlorn than it probably was in the brightness of midday. And something unexpected stirred inside me, something I could not quite explain or name, because the house was not just damaged, not just neglected, not just ugly. It was abandoned in a way that felt familiar, overlooked by everyone who passed it, dismissed as worthless by people who did not bother to look past the surface, left behind by something that had once claimed it, discarded like something that no longer served a purpose. I knew how that felt. I knew it in my bones and my blood, in the hollow space where my sense of self used to live. A man appeared on the porch of the house 2 doors down, his arrival so quiet that I did not notice him until he was already watching me. Older, maybe late 50s, with broad shoulders that spoke of physical labor and hands that looked like they had spent years working with wood and tools and the honest materials of building. His face was weathered by sun and wind, lined in ways that suggested he smiled often, though he was not smiling now. He watched me for a moment, his expression curious but guarded, then walked slowly toward the chain-link fence that separated his well-maintained yard from the cracked sidewalk where I stood. "You hear about the house?" he asked, his voice carrying the flat vowels of someone who had lived in Ohio his whole life. A nod was my only response. Words seemed unnecessary, and I was not sure I could trust my voice to be steady anyway. His glance moved to the property I was standing in front of, then back to me. Something careful lived in his expression, something guarded, like a man who had seen this scene play out before and was not optimistic about how it would end this time. "Bennett Holloway," he said, offering the name like it was a handshake without the physical contact. "Been here 15 years. Watched a lot of people come and look at that place. Never seen one stay yet." Vivian Ashford. He nodded as if the name confirmed something he had already suspected. "You know about this place then? What they say about it? The stories." The man at the office mentioned some things. A sound escaped him that was almost a laugh, but not quite. Too tired to be genuinely amused, too knowing to be surprised. "Some things, that is one way to put it." He leaned against the fence, his calloused hands resting on the top rail, his eyes still fixed on the house as if he were watching something I could not see. "3 buyers before you, just like he probably told you. All of them came with plans, big ideas about what they were going to do with the place. None of them lasted more than a few weeks before they were running for their lives." "Do you believe it?" I asked. The question came out more directly than I intended, but I needed to know. "That the house is cursed?" Silence stretched between us for a long moment, filled only by the sound of wind moving through the overgrown grass and the distant bark of a dog somewhere down the street. Then his head shook slowly, a gesture that seemed to carry the weight of years of thinking about this question. "Some places hold on to things," he said finally, choosing his words with the care of someone who had thought about them for a long time. Pain, memory, grief, whatever you want to call it. Some places absorb what happens inside them, and they hold on to it long after the people are gone. Most folks do not have the patience to sit with that. They feel something wrong in the air, something heavy in the walls, and they run. They call it a curse because that is easier than sitting with discomfort. My eyes returned to the house, to the broken windows and the sagging porch, and the weeds that had claimed the yard like an invading army that had won its war. What was she like? I asked. Harriet, the woman who lived there. Bennett's expression softened slightly, the guardedness melting into something that looked almost like grief. Good woman, kind in the quiet way that does not need to announce itself. Kept to herself mostly, did not come to block parties or neighborhood barbecues, but she was always willing to help when someone needed it. Fixed my roof one summer when I could not afford to pay a contractor, worked on it for 3 days in the July heat, would not take a single dollar for it no matter how much I insisted. He paused, his eyes growing distant with memory. She deserved better than this. Better than dying alone with no one to notice for 3 days. Better than being forgotten by everyone except the people who blame her house for their own bad luck and poor decisions. Did she have any family? The question came before I could stop it, pulled out of me by some instinct I did not fully understand. Anyone who might have cared about what happened to her? Anyone who might still be looking for answers? Bennett thought for a moment, his brow furrowing with the effort of recall. She mentioned a nephew once. Or maybe it was a great-nephew, I do not remember exactly. Said he was studying law somewhere, one of those big universities that sound impressive. She was proud of him, I could tell, the way her face lit up when she talked about him. His eyes grew more distant, seeing something far away in time. Do not know if they stayed in touch over the years. Harriet kept most things to herself, and I did not pry. Figured if she wanted to share, she would. The information filed itself away in my mind. A nephew, a law student, someone who might have cared about her once, someone who might still be wondering what really happened to his aunt. Long after Bennett went back inside his house, after the sky had begun to darken and the streetlights had flickered on one by one, I remained standing at the edge of that overgrown property. The evening air had turned cold, carrying the smell of wood smoke from someone's fireplace and the promise of frost before morning. My thoughts turned to everything I had lost in recent weeks. The home that was never really mine, though I had lived in it for 3 decades. The business I had built with my own hands for someone else's benefit. The marriage that had been dismantled without my knowledge or consent, taken apart piece by piece while I continued believing it was solid. And then my thoughts turned to this place, this broken, forgotten house that no one wanted. This property that had been reduced to a $3 price tag because even that seemed generous for something so damaged. For $3, no one expected anything from it. No one was fighting over it in court. No one had already taken it away and transferred it into accounts I could not access. No one was going to show up with lawyers and paperwork telling me it had never really been mine. For the first time in 3 weeks, my eyes were looking at something that could finally, truly belong to me. Something I could hold on to. Something no one could take away. The papers were signed the next morning. The first night was cold. Wind slipped through cracks in the window frames that I had not noticed during the daylight walkthrough, carrying the smell of dust and old wood and something else, something fainter and more personal, like lavender that had been dried and forgotten in a drawer for years. Harriet's scent, perhaps, still lingering in the walls after all this time, a ghost of the woman who had lived here, a trace of the life that had filled these rooms before silence moved in. Sleep came fitfully on an old blanket in the corner of what had once been the living room. My suitcase beside me like a faithful companion who had followed me into this strange new territory. The wool was rough against my skin, scratchy and worn thin in places where moths or time had eaten away at the fabric, but it held warmth better than expected. Every step I had taken during my evening exploration had made the floor creak, the sound sharp and startling in the silence, like the house was announcing my presence to whatever spirits might be listening. The walls groaned when the wind picked up, settling and shifting with sounds that might have been the natural movements of an old structure, or might have been something else entirely. More than once, sleep refused to come as the sounds of the house filled the darkness around me. The settling of old timber, the scratch of branches against the roof, the scurry of what I hoped were mice rather than something larger, the distant hum of a highway somewhere beyond the trees, carrying travelers to destinations I would never know. More than once I lay awake listening to every noise, half expecting the whole structure to collapse before morning, half expecting to feel the floor give way beneath me and drop me into whatever darkness waited below. But the house held together, and so did I. By the second day, cleaning had begun. Not because the damage could be fixed quickly, not because I had any real plan for what this place could become, not because I believed I could transform this wreck into anything resembling a home, but because doing something, anything, felt better than standing still. Better than sitting in the corner with my suitcase thinking about everything I had lost. Better than waiting for the next bad thing to happen. The work was slow, methodical. Broken furniture cleared from rooms that had not been touched in years, dragged out to the curb piece by piece. Decades of dirt and debris swept into piles and hauled outside in garbage bags that split from the weight. Windows opened that resisted as if they had not been moved since Harriet's death, their frames swollen with moisture and age, finally giving way with protesting squeals to let light fall into spaces that had forgotten what it looked like. My hands grew raw from the work. The skin cracked at the knuckles where the cold and the dust had dried them out, bleeding in small lines that stung when I washed them. The taste of grit stayed in my mouth no matter how much water I drank, a constant reminder of the decades of neglect I was trying to undo. My back ached from bending and lifting and carrying. My shoulders burned from scrubbing walls and pulling down rotted wallpaper. My whole body protested this sudden demand for physical labor after years of gentler work behind a shop counter. But something satisfying lived in it, something real and tangible and mine. Every bag of garbage I carried out was progress I could see. Every window I cleaned was light I had let in. Every inch of floor I swept was space I had reclaimed. The neighbors noticed, of course. They watched from their porches with cups of coffee, their conversations pausing when I emerged with another load of debris. They paused at the ends of their driveways to observe my progress, pretending to check their mailboxes or adjust their lawn decorations while their eyes tracked my movements. They whispered in the way people do when they do not expect to be heard, their voices carrying on the autumn air in fragments that I caught when the wind shifted. Everyone on Winslow Street knew this house, knew its reputation, knew the stories that had kept buyers away for years, the tales of misfortune that grew more elaborate with each telling. The businessman who went bankrupt, the woman whose marriage collapsed, the man who died in the front yard, his heart stopping before he could even unlock the door. None of them believed I would last long enough to make a difference. I could see it in their careful politeness when they waved, in the pity that lived behind their smiles. They were just waiting for the next chapter of the curse to unfold, waiting to see what disaster would befall the latest fool who thought she could claim this place. On the third day, Gordon came. His silver sedan appeared while I stood on the porch, sweeping dust and dead leaves from boards that groaned beneath my feet. The car was expensive and polished, gleaming in the autumn sunlight, looking so out of place on this shabby street that it might have been a spaceship that had landed among the farmhouses. Celia sat in the passenger seat, her face turned toward her phone, her attention fixed on the screen as if she could pretend she was somewhere else entirely. Gordon stepped out of the car and looked at the house. Then he looked at me, and he laughed, not a kind laugh, not even a surprised one, but the laugh of someone who has just had their lowest expectations confirmed, who has caught someone doing exactly the pathetic thing he predicted they would do. "This is what you are doing with your fresh start?" he asked, his voice carrying the condescension of 32 years of believing himself superior. "Living in a condemned building? Playing house in a place that should have been torn down decades ago?" No words came from my lips, just silence as I stood there with the broom in my hand, looking at the man I had married young and stayed with through everything, the man I had trusted with my life and my future and my sense of who I was. He walked closer, stopping at the edge of the overgrown yard as if stepping onto the property itself would contaminate him. His shoes were Italian leather, polished to a high shine. His suit was tailored, fitting his body perfectly. Everything about him screamed success and competence, and the kind of life I had thought we shared. Vivian, this is ridiculous. This place is worthless. Worse than worthless. It is going to fall apart around you, probably while you are sleeping. You will be lucky if you do not end up in the hospital or the morgue, like that other fool who thought he could fix it up. Then it will be my wreckage. The words came out quiet but steady, surprising me almost as much as they surprised him. I had not planned to say them, had not even thought them consciously. They just emerged, rising up from somewhere deep inside me that had not spoken in 32 years. Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or irritation that I had dared to respond at all, much less with something that sounded like defiance. He was not used to me speaking back, not used to me standing my ground, not used to any version of me other than the agreeable, helpful wife who made his life comfortable. I am trying to help you, he said, his voice taking on the patient, reasonable tone he used when he thought he was being generous and misunderstood. I will give you $500 for this place. Right now, today, cash in hand. You can use it to find somewhere decent to live. Get yourself together. Start acting like a rational adult instead of whatever this is supposed to be. $500 for a house I had paid $3 to own. It should have seemed like a generous offer, a windfall, a gift from an ex-husband who could easily have ignored me completely. But all I could hear was the dismissal in his voice, the assumption that I needed to be rescued, that I could not possibly make something of this on my own, that even now, even after he had taken everything else, he still believed he knew better than I did what I should do with my life. No. The word came out quieter than expected, but steady, final, a period at the end of a sentence that had been waiting 32 years to be spoken. Gordon stared at me. No, no, I am keeping it. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The wind moved through the overgrown grass, rustling the weeds with a sound like whispered secrets. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. Celia remained in the car, her face still turned toward her phone, determined not to witness whatever was happening between her parents. Then Gordon shook his head, the gesture carrying all the contempt and disbelief he did not bother to hide. He turned back toward the car without another word, dismissing me as thoroughly as he had dismissed everything I had contributed to our life together. Fine, he said over his shoulder, not bothering to turn around. Stay here in your haunted house. Play pretend as long as you want, but do not come to me when it falls apart. Do not call looking for help when you finally admit this was a mistake. His car pulled away without him looking back, the silver sedan disappearing around the corner and taking with it the last visible remnant of my old life. Celia never turned to face me, not once, not even a glance in the side mirror to see if I was still standing there. My eyes followed the car until it vanished, until the sound of its engine faded into the general noise of the neighborhood. Then the broom returned to my hands and I went back to sweeping the porch, and the work continued. If you have ever had someone dismiss everything you built, everything you gave, every year of effort and love and dedication, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment and tell me how you responded. Did you fight back or did you walk away? Did you find your voice or did it take years before you could speak? Your story might be the one that helps someone else find their own strength. Now let me tell you what happened when I started digging into the secrets this house was hiding. The days settled into a rhythm that was almost peaceful, though peace was not quite the right word for it. It was more like the rhythm of work, of purpose, of having something to do each morning when I opened my eyes. Dawn arrived before I was ready for it each morning. Gray light filtering through windows I was slowly learning to clean. But sleep had become something that happened in snatches anyway. Grabbed in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when the house settled into its deepest silence, and there was always work waiting to be done. Sweeping, scrubbing, pulling down rotted wallpaper that came away in strips like dead skin. Prying up boards that had warped beyond repair, the nails squealing as they released their grip on wood they had held for decades. Carrying debris to the curb in bags and boxes and armloads that left my clothes covered in dust and my muscles aching with a good kind of pain. The house seemed to breathe a little easier with each piece of debris removed, each window cleaned, each room reclaimed from years of neglect. It was probably my imagination, but I could almost feel it relaxing around me, letting go of tension it had been holding since Harriet died alone in its hallway. Or maybe that was just me, projecting my own relief onto walls that could not feel anything at all. Bennett appeared on the fourth day. He did not knock, did not call out a greeting or wait for permission, just materialized on the porch with a toolbox in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other, as if helping a stranger repair a cursed house was the most natural thing in the world. "Figured you could use some help," he said, extending the thermos toward me. The coffee inside was still hot, steam rising from the cap when I unscrewed it. "Also figured you could use some decent coffee. That stuff from the gas station will kill you faster than any curse." No argument came from me. Exhaustion had settled too deeply into my bones, and the work was clearly too much for one person. Besides, there was something comforting about his presence, something steady and reliable that I had not realized I was missing until it appeared. The lock on the front door was his first project, the old mechanism so rusted that it had been useless anyway. Then the broken window in the kitchen, carefully measured and fitted with new glass that let the morning light pour in. He worked quietly without small talk or unnecessary conversation, but something comfortable lived in his presence, something that asked nothing and offered something real. "You knew Harriet well?" The question came one afternoon while we replaced a section of floorboard in the hallway. The old wood splintered and soft with rot. His hammer paused against the nail he was driving, the sound echoing into sudden silence. "Well enough, I suppose. She was a private person, did not talk much about herself, did not share stories about her past or her family or whatever had brought her to this house in the first place. But she was good, the kind of good that does not need to announce itself or ask for recognition." "What happened to her?" "Really happened, I mean. Not the stories about curses and bad luck. Heart gave out. At least that is what the coroner said when they finally got around to examining her. Found her right here, in this hallway we are working on now. She had been gone for 3 days before anyone noticed something was wrong. 3 days of mail piling up in the box. 3 days of newspapers accumulating on the porch. 3 days of a woman lying dead in her own home with no one to miss her." My eyes dropped to the floor beneath my feet, the floor where Harriet Colvin had died alone. The wood was worn smooth in places, marked by decades of her footsteps. I wondered if she had known she was dying, wondered if she had tried to reach the phone or the door, wondered if her last thoughts had been of the nephew she was proud of, or the life she had lived in these rooms, or simply the unfairness of ending this way. "She deserved better," Bennett said quietly, echoing what he had said that first day we met. "Someone should have been there. Someone should have noticed." We worked in silence after that, the only sounds the hammer strikes and the creak of old boards. But his words stayed with me, settling into the house alongside the dust and the memories. It was on the 7th day that everything changed. The dining room had become almost livable by then, cleared enough to serve as a workspace and a place to sit when my body demanded rest. The floor was in better condition than the rest of the house, the boards fitting together more tightly, the wood less warped by time and weather. Someone had taken care of this room, I realized, had maintained it more carefully than the rest of the house, as if it held some special significance. But something near the center of the room kept catching my attention. One board sat slightly higher than the others, just enough to notice if you were looking, just enough to feel beneath your feet if you walked across it slowly. A small irregularity that my eyes kept returning to, that my feet kept stumbling over, that refused to fade into the background no matter how many times I told myself it was nothing. At first, the anomaly was ignored, just another sign of the house settling, another imperfection in a building full of imperfections, another repair that would need to wait its turn behind more urgent projects. But the more I moved around the room, the more it stood out. A small detail that refused to blend into the background, a piece that did not quite fit, a whisper at the edge of hearing that kept getting louder. Eventually, curiosity won. My knees hit the floor and my hand ran along the edge of the raised board. It felt different from the others, smoother somehow. the edges more carefully cut, deliberate in a way that spoke of intention rather than accident. A flathead screwdriver worked its way into the gap between the boards. The wood resisted at first, holding on to whatever secret it had been protecting. Then it gave way with a sharp crack that echoed through the empty room like a gunshot, like a door being forced open, like the breaking of a seal that had been intact for decades. Beneath the board was a hollow space that did not match the rest of the floor's structure. Not a gap caused by rot or settling, not an accidental void left by careless construction. This was intentional, carefully created, deliberately hidden. Inside the hollow sat a metal box, worn and weathered, the surface marked by years of darkness and moisture, but intact, protected from everything except the slow passage of time, as if someone had placed it there carefully, knowing it would be found eventually, but wanting to make sure only the right person would discover it. The box lifted out slowly, heavier than expected, the weight of something real, something important, something that had been waiting in the darkness for exactly this moment. My hands trembled as I set it on the floor beside me, the same trembling I had felt when signing those divorce papers 3 weeks ago, when realizing that everything I thought I knew had been wrong, when understanding that my life had been built on foundations I did not own. Because this moment felt different too, like stepping into something I did not fully understand yet, like opening a door that could not be closed again. The lid opened with a creak of old hinges. Inside were documents, neatly folded despite their age, protected by the metal that surrounded them. Letters tied together with a faded ribbon that had once been blue, now gray with dust and time, and a sealed envelope placed on top of everything else, positioned carefully as if it were the most important thing in the box. Handwriting covered the front of the envelope. Careful and deliberate, each letter formed with precision despite the slight tremor that suggested an elderly hand. The ink had faded slightly over the years, but the words were still clear, still legible, still waiting to be read. To whoever finally stays. Something shifted inside me when I read those words. Not a warning, though the words carried weight. Not a message left in fear, though they spoke of something that had been hidden, but recognition, understanding, connection. Like whoever had written them had known that one day someone would come along who would not walk away. Someone who would see past the rumors and the curses and the $3 price tag. Someone who would stay when everyone else had fled. Someone like me. The envelope opened slowly, my fingers careful not to tear the aged paper. The letter inside was written on thin stationery, the kind that felt fragile beneath my fingers, that might crumble if handled too roughly. The handwriting was shaky in places, wavering in ways that suggested the writer had been elderly or ill or both. But the words themselves were steady, clear, purposeful. "If you are reading this," the letter began, "then you are the one who stayed. I have waited a long time for someone like you. I have watched 3 others come and go, frightened away by their own failures that they blamed on me and my home. But you stayed, and that means you are ready to know the truth." The reading continued, and with each paragraph, the picture became clearer, darker, more complicated than anything I had imagined. Harriet Colvin had not simply died in this house. She had left behind something she had protected for over 40 years. Evidence of a wrong that had never been made right, a crime that had never been punished, a theft that had been covered up by people with money and power, and lawyers who knew how to make inconvenient truths disappear. The letter spoke of ownership, of land that had been taken through processes that looked legal on paper, but were built on lies and intimidation, of documents that proved what had really happened, hidden away because they would have been ignored or dismissed or destroyed if left in the open. And it spoke of names, people who had been involved, people who had profited from what she had lost, names that meant nothing to me at first, but which I would come to know all too well. One name appeared more than once, circled in some places, underlined in others. Warren Kessler. The other documents came out of the box one by one, each one adding another piece to the puzzle. Land surveys from the 1970s, transfer records that showed properties changing hands for impossibly low prices, legal correspondence that revealed the pressure tactics used to force owners to sell, a map drawn by hand, marking properties that extended far beyond the boundaries of this single lot, showing a pattern of acquisition that spread across the county. The pieces fell into place slowly, then all at once. This house was not just a forgotten property, it was evidence. Proof that Harriet Colvin had been systematically stripped of land that was rightfully hers. Land that had since been developed, built upon, turned into shopping centers and office parks and subdivisions that made millions for the people who had stolen it. And the people who had taken it had never expected anyone to find out. Had never imagined that a lonely woman in a falling down house would carefully document everything, hide the evidence where only the right person could find it, and wait for justice that might never come. The county records office was a small building on the edge of downtown, the kind of place that felt like it had not been updated since the 1980s. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with that particular frequency that causes headaches after too long. Filing cabinets lined the walls in rows that stretched back into shadows. The smell of old paper and older coffee hung in the air. A woman sat behind the front desk, typing something slowly with two fingers, her attention fixed on a computer screen that looked almost as old as the building itself. "I need to look up some property records," I said, approaching the desk. "Land transfers from the late 70s and early 80s. Her eyes glanced up briefly, her expression neither friendly nor hostile, just the bland indifference of someone doing a job they had done too many times to count. "Fill out a request form. It will take 3 to 5 business days for processing." "Is there any way to speed that up? I have specific documents I'm looking for. Names and dates and property locations." A sigh escaped her, the sound of someone who had heard this request 1,000 times and given the same answer every time. A form slid across the counter toward me. "Fill it out. 3 to 5 days. That is the policy." The form was filled out with as much detail as I could provide. Contact information left. The drive home made with the metal box sitting on the passenger seat beside me, its contents seeming to grow heavier with every mile. Over the next 2 weeks, everything in that box was read, every document examined, every name noted, dates and locations cross-referenced with public records that I accessed through the library's computer system. Lists made of properties that had changed hands during the years Harriet mentioned in her letter. The pattern became clearer with each page studied, each connection made, each piece of evidence added to the whole. 12 properties in total, all of them owned by women living alone, widows whose husbands had died and left them without protection, elderly women without family nearby who might have asked questions, people who were easy to overlook in official proceedings, easy to pressure in private conversations, easy to forget once the papers were signed. All of them had sold their land to the same company, Kessler Development, for prices that were far below market value, sometimes pennies on the dollar, always under circumstances that seemed legal but smelled of coercion. And all of those properties were now part of a commercial district that had transformed this part of the county. Shopping centers that drew customers from 3 states away. Office parks that housed Fortune 500 companies. Residential subdivisions where houses sold for $500,000 each. Warren Kessler had built an empire, and he had built it on land stolen from women who had no one to fight for them. 3 lawyers were found in the phone book, their advertisements promising justice and compensation, and all the things that people with legal problems needed to hear. Each one was called. The situation explained. The first one listened politely for about 5 minutes, then interrupted to explain that the case was too complicated and too old to be worth pursuing. "Statute of limitations," he said, as if those words ended all discussion. "Even if what you are saying is true, it happened too long ago. There is nothing anyone can do now." The second one asked about money for a retainer before I had finished explaining the situation. When I told him I had nothing, that everything I had once owned had been taken in my divorce, he suggested I find someone else. "Pro bono cases are for law students and idealists," he said with a laugh that was not kind. "I have bills to pay." The third one, An older man with a tired voice that suggested he had seen too much disappointment in his career was more direct. Ma'am, he said, even if everything you are saying is 100% true, even if you have ironclad evidence that would hold up in any court, you are going up against Warren Kessler. Do you understand what that means? He has more money than some small countries. He has lawyers on retainer who bill more per hour than most people make in a week. He has connections to every judge and politician in this part of the state. And you are a woman living in a condemned house with no resources, no legal experience, and no standing to bring a case. He paused, and when he spoke again, there was something almost like sympathy in his voice. No one is going to take this case. I am sorry, but that is the reality of how the world works. The phone returned to its cradle, and silence filled the small room that had become my home. He was right. No money, no connections, no standing in this community or any other, no credentials that would make anyone take me seriously. Exactly the kind of person who could be dismissed with a wave of the hand, overlooked in crowded rooms, ignored when speaking, just like Harriet Colvin had been ignored. Just like all those other women whose land had been taken while they had no one to fight for them. The visit came 3 days later. Weeds were being pulled from what had once been a flower bed when the car appeared at the curb. Black and expensive, gleaming with the kind of polish that came from being detailed every week. The kind of car that cost more than most people made in a year. 2 men emerged. One stayed by the vehicle, his posture that of a bodyguard or a driver who doubled as muscle. The other walked toward me, his stride confident, his expression pleasant in a way that did not reach his eyes. He was older, maybe mid-60s, with silver hair styled perfectly, and a suit that probably cost more than everything I had managed to salvage from my marriage. His face was the kind of face that appeared in newspaper photographs, the face of a man who was used to being important, to having his calls returned immediately, to getting what he wanted without having to ask twice. Mrs. Ashford, he said, and the fact that he knew my name sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. I am Warren Kessler. I believe you have been asking some questions about me. My hands brushed dirt from my palms as I stood slowly, facing him across the overgrown yard. I know who you are. His smile did not waver, but something shifted behind his eyes, something that was calculating even as it pretended to be friendly. I understand you found some old papers in this house, some documents that belonged to the previous owner, a confused woman who made accusations near the end of her life that had no basis in reality. He spread his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. I am sorry if you have been taken in by her delusions. It must be confusing, finding something like that, not knowing the context. They do not look like delusions to me. For a moment something flickered behind his pleasant expression, something cold and hard and dangerous. Then the mask returned, as smooth as it had been before. Mrs. Ashford, I am a reasonable man. I understand that you have been through a difficult time recently. Divorce can be disorienting. It can make people see conspiracies where there are only coincidences. And this house, his gaze moved to the building behind me, dismissing it with a glance. This house is not fit for anyone to live in. It is a hazard, a liability, a burden that no one should have to carry. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had taken on a tone of false generosity. Let me help you. I will buy this property from you. $50,000, cash, transferred to any account you name within 24 hours. You can use it to start over somewhere comfortable, somewhere safe, somewhere that does not require you to spend every day fighting a battle you cannot win. $50,000. More money than I had seen in years. More than enough to find a decent apartment in a nice part of town. To buy furniture that was not salvaged from curbsides. To rebuild some version of a normal life. But something about the offer made my skin crawl. The way he said it, the certainty in his voice, the assumption, buried beneath the friendly words, that of course I would say yes. That of course I could be bought. That everyone had a price and mine was apparently $50,000. Why? I asked, keeping my voice steady with effort. Why would you pay $50,000 for a house you just said was worthless? For a property that cost me $3? His smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Because I am a generous man. Because I feel sorry for what you are going through. And because I would hate to see you waste more of your time on something that will only bring you disappointment in the end. My eyes held his, taking in the expensive suit, the confident posture, the careful, calculated smile that hid whatever was really going on behind it. And my thoughts turned to Harriet Colvin, who had been called confused, who had been dismissed and ignored, who had hidden her evidence because she knew that speaking the truth would only get her hurt, that the people who had taken her land would take everything else if she gave them the chance. No, I said. Kessler blinked, and for just a second, genuine surprise flickered across his face. Excuse me? No, I am not selling. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The wind rustled through the overgrown grass. The driver by the car shifted his weight, his hand moving slightly toward his jacket. Somewhere down the street, the same dog that always barked began its afternoon chorus. Then Kessler's expression changed. The pleasant mask slipped away, revealing something harder beneath. Something that had been waiting there all along, hidden behind the smiles and the generous offers and the reasonable tone. "You are making a mistake," he said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that felt like a threat even without explicit words. "This house has a history of bringing bad luck to the people who try to claim it. Terrible things have happened to people who would not listen to reason. I would hate very much to see that pattern continue with you." He turned and walked back to his car without waiting for a response, his posture still confident, his stride still unhurried. The vehicle pulled away smoothly, disappearing around the corner, leaving me standing alone in the yard with my heart pounding and my hands shaking. That night, sleep was impossible. Every sound the house made seemed amplified, threatening. The creaking of old wood, the wind against the windows, the settling of a structure that had been standing for decades, making noises that might have been natural or might have been something else. And sometime after midnight, well past the hour when the neighborhood had fallen completely silent, glass shattered. The brick lay on the floor of the living room when I stumbled out of my makeshift bedroom, surrounded by shards from the broken window that glittered in the moonlight like scattered diamonds. No note attached. No message painted on the brick or thrown in behind it. No explanation needed. The meaning was clear enough. Bennett arrived within minutes. He had heard the crash from his house and come running, wearing pajamas and boots that did not match, a flashlight in one hand and something that might have been a baseball bat in the other. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his eyes scanning me for injuries, then scanning the room for intruders. My head shook. "Just the window. Just a warning." His eyes moved to the brick on the floor, then back to me. His expression was serious in a way I had not seen before. The friendly neighbor replaced by something harder, something that had seen trouble before and knew what it looked like. "This is Kessler," he said. It was not a question. "He came by earlier today, offered to buy the house for $50,000. I said no." Bennett was quiet for a long moment, processing this information, fitting it into whatever he already knew about the situation. Then he nodded slowly, a gesture that seemed to carry weight. "You know what you're getting into," he said. "This is not going to be easy. Kessler has power in this town, money that opens doors and closes mouths, connections to everyone who matters, and you have nothing," I finished for him. "I know. I have absolutely nothing." His head shook. "That is not what I was going to say." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "You have something he does not have. You have the truth. You have evidence that he thought was lost forever. And you have at least one person who believes you." He helped board up the broken window that night, working by flashlight and determination. And when he finally left, I sat alone in the living room, holding Harriet's letter in my hands, reading those words again. "To whoever finally stays." I was staying, and I was not going anywhere. What would you do if you were in my position? Would you keep fighting, even when everyone told you to stop? Even when the threats got personal? Even when the most powerful man in the county made it clear that your stubbornness would have consequences? Or would you take the money and walk away, telling yourself that discretion was the better part of valor? Tell me in the comments. And if you are still with me, stay close, because someone unexpected was about to walk through my door. Someone who would change everything. But the hardest blow came from someone I never expected to hurt me. Celia appeared on my doorstep 3 days after the window was broken, standing on the porch that no longer sagged quite so badly, looking at the repairs that had transformed the exterior from disaster to merely neglected. She looked uncomfortable, her arms crossed over her chest in a defensive posture, her eyes avoiding mine as if making contact would force her to confront something she did not want to see. "Mom," she said, and her voice was different from the dismissive tone she had used in Gordon's office. Harder now, more urgent, more afraid. "You need to stop this." "Stop what exactly?" "Whatever you are doing with this house. The questions you have been asking around town, the lawyers you have been calling, the research you have been doing at the library." She paused and something that might have been guilt flickered across her face. "Dad told me what is going on, about the man who came to see you, about the offer you refused. He is worried about you. Your father is worried about himself." Celia's expression hardened, the guilt vanishing beneath something that looked like anger. "That is not fair. He has been concerned about you ever since you bought this place. He thinks you have had some kind of breakdown. He thinks the divorce pushed you over the edge, and now you are obsessing over conspiracy theories instead of dealing with reality. And what about you, Celia? What do you think?" No answer came for a long moment. She stood on my porch, looking at the house her mother had chosen over $50,000 in security and the chance to pretend nothing was wrong with the world, and I could see her trying to decide what to say. "I think you should let it go," she said finally. "Move on with your life. Stop living in this falling apart house and pretending you are going to change anything. You are not a lawyer, Mom. You are not a detective. You are a 54-year-old woman who used to run an antique shop, and now you are trying to take on one of the most powerful men in the state. And what if I told you that your father was involved? That the lawyers I have been calling might have his name in their files too? That the conspiracy you think I am imagining might reach all the way into the life we used to share?" Celia's face went pale. She took a step back, her foot catching on a loose board, her balance wavering for just a moment before she caught herself on the railing. "That is not. He would not. I do not know what he would or would not do," I said, and my voice was quieter now, carrying the weight of sadness rather than accusation. "I do not know anything anymore. Everything I thought I knew about my life turned out to be wrong. But I know what I found in this house. I know what Harriet Colvin documented before she died, and I know that someone is very scared about what might happen if that evidence comes to light." Celia left without saying goodbye, her car pulling away from the curb with more speed than the quiet street warranted. I stood in the doorway, watching her disappear, feeling something crack open inside my chest. My daughter had not come to check on me, to make sure I was safe, to offer support during a difficult time. She had come to warn me off, to protect her father from whatever I was about to uncover, to choose his side once again, just as she had chosen it in that office 3 weeks ago. And in that moment, I understood that I was truly alone in this, that the family I had built, the daughter I had raised, the connections I had maintained for 32 years, could not be counted on when things got difficult. The small table I had salvaged from the debris became my desk that night. The documents spread out in front of me, organized by date and category. Harriet's letter read one more time, her words burning themselves into my memory. "To whoever finally stays." Harriet had been alone too. She had known that no one would believe her if she spoke up, that the truth she had uncovered would be dismissed and buried and forgotten, like so many other inconvenient truths before it. That the people who had taken her land would take everything else if she gave them the chance to silence her. But she had not given up. She had hidden her evidence where only the right person could find it, waited for years, decades, for someone to come along who would not walk away, trusted that eventually someone would stay. One more call was made that night, reaching out to a legal aid organization that offered free consultations to people who could not afford attorneys. It was not much, but it was a start. The young man who appeared on my porch 1 week later did not look like salvation. He was maybe 32, with wire-rimmed glasses and a messenger bag slung over his shoulder that looked like it had been carried through law school and beyond. His suit was decent, but not expensive. The kind of thing a young professional might buy at a department store sale when he was just starting out and could not yet afford the tailored options. There was a nervous energy about him, a quality of uncertainty that suggested he was not entirely sure he should be there. "Mrs. Ashford?" he asked, looking at the house behind me with an expression I could not quite read. "Vivian Ashford?" A nod was my only response, one hand still on the doorframe, ready to close it if this turned out to be another threat dressed in professional clothing. "My name is Nolan Brennan. I am an attorney. I work with the Legal Aid Society, among other things." He paused, and something shifted in his expression, something that looked almost like emotion. "And I think we need to talk about my aunt." My grip on the doorframe tightened. "Your aunt?" "Harriet Colvin," he said, and the name changed everything. "She was my mother's sister. She raised me for a few years when I was a kid, after my parents divorced, and neither of them was in a position to take care of me properly. She taught me to read. She made me believe I could be anything I wanted to be." He swallowed hard, fighting to keep his composure. "Before things got complicated, before family drama pulled us apart, she was the person who made me want to become a lawyer in the first place." The door opened wider, and I stepped aside to let him in. We sat at the small table in the dining room, the same table where Harriet's documents had been spread out so many times, where I had read her letter over and over until I could recite it from memory. Nolan looked around the house with an expression that was difficult to read, his eyes lingering on details that must have been familiar to him from childhood visits. A fireplace he might have sat beside, a window seat he might have read books in, the echoes of a woman he had loved, still present in the walls she had left behind. "I heard you found something," he said finally, pulling himself back to the present. "Something my aunt left behind. Something she was protecting." "Who told you?" "Word travels in small towns, especially when it involves Warren Kessler. I have contacts at the legal aid office who mentioned that someone had been asking about old property records, that someone had been trying to find a lawyer willing to take on an impossible case." He almost smiled. "And I have been keeping an eye on this house for a while, waiting to see if anyone would finally stay long enough to find what she hid." The metal box slid across the table toward him. "Under the floorboards, in the dining room, right where you are sitting now." Nolan opened the box slowly, his hands almost reverent. His breath caught as he looked at the documents inside. The letters, the maps, the legal records that documented 40 years of systematic theft. The envelope addressed to whoever finally stayed. "She told me about this once," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "When I was 16, before we lost touch. She said she had evidence of something terrible, something that powerful people had done to her and to others like her. She said no one would believe her if she tried to speak up, that the lawyers and the judges and the politicians were all connected to each other, all protecting each other." He looked up at me, and I could see the teenager he had been, listening to his aunt tell stories that sounded too terrible to be true. "She said she was going to hide her evidence somewhere safe and wait for the right person to find it. She said that someday someone would come along who would not be afraid to tell the truth. Why did she not give it to you? You became a lawyer. You could have done something with this." His head shook, the gesture heavy with regret. "I was just a kid when she first told me. And then I went off to law school, got caught up in the pressure to get good grades and find a good job, and we lost touch. She did not want to burden me, I think. She knew how hard it was to fight people like Kessler, how many careers and lives they had destroyed when people tried to stand up to them." He paused, staring at the documents as if they contained ghosts. "She said if I ever found the evidence, it would be because I was meant to find it, not because she had forced it on me, not because she had made it my burden to carry." He looked up at me. "But she never imagined a stranger would be the one to stay. A woman who had lost everything, just like she had. A woman who had nothing left to lose." He read through the documents carefully over the next hour, his legal training evident in the way he organized the information, cross-referenced the names and dates, built a picture of the conspiracy from the pieces Harriet had collected. His expression changed as the full scope of what had been done became clear. "This is bigger than I thought," he said finally, setting down the last document. "It is not just Aunt Harriet. It is a pattern that stretches back decades, systematic, organized, targeting the most vulnerable people in the community. Warren Kessler, I said. Nolan nodded. And his father before him. The family has been doing this for at least 40 years. They targeted vulnerable people, people who had no one to fight for them. Widows, elderly women living alone, people who could be pressured and intimidated and eventually silenced. He looked at me with an expression that might have been recognition. People like you. The words hung in the air between us. People like me. People who could be dismissed, overlooked, erased. I spent 3 years working for a big law firm in Columbus after I graduated, Nolan said. Corporate law, mergers and acquisitions. I was good at it. The partners liked me. I was on track to make a lot of money and have a very comfortable life. He looked around the room that his aunt had lived in, the house she had died in, the place where her evidence had been hidden and waiting. But I hated it. Every day I helped rich people get richer. I helped corporations avoid accountability. I used the skills my aunt had encouraged me to develop, the education she had believed in, to make the world a little bit worse. He met my eyes directly. I came back here 6 months ago, left the firm, took a massive pay cut to work with legal aid. I wanted to do something that mattered, something that would have made Aunt Harriet proud. And you think this matters? I think this is exactly why I became a lawyer in the first place. I think this is why she taught me to read and encouraged me to dream and believed in me when no one else did. His voice strengthened with conviction. I think this is what I was meant to do. Over the next month, Nolan and I worked together, building a case from the evidence Harriet had preserved. He had access to resources I did not. Legal databases that required expensive subscriptions, historical records that were only available to licensed attorneys, contacts in the county offices who remembered him from childhood, who had known his aunt, who were willing to dig deeper than the policy-bound clerks who had dismissed me. The picture that emerged was worse than I had imagined, worse than even Harriet's documents had suggested. 12 families in total, all of them targeted over a 40-year period, all of them pressured into selling their land for fractions of its real value, some through legal manipulation, through documents that were deliberately confusing and processes that were designed to overwhelm, some through outright intimidation, through threatening letters and anonymous phone calls and accidents that might not have been accidents at all. Some through offers that seemed generous at first until you understood what was really being taken and what it would eventually be worth. And all of that land was now part of the Kessler development empire, shopping centers that drew customers from across the region, office parks that housed major corporations, residential subdivisions where houses sold for amounts that would have been unimaginable to the women who had been forced off their land decades ago. Millions of dollars built on a foundation of stolen property, an empire constructed from the suffering of people who had no one to fight for them. One name in particular stood out among the victims, a woman whose story resonated with something deep inside me. Ruth Pemberton, 83 years old when she signed away her family's farm in 1982. A widow whose husband had died of a heart attack, leaving her alone on land that her family had worked for 3 generations. The Kesslers had told her she owed thousands of dollars in back taxes, had shown her documents that looked official, had pressured her to sign papers she did not fully understand. Her granddaughter, a woman named Clara, had been searching for answers for years, never quite believing the official story, never quite able to prove that something wrong had happened. Nolan found her through the county records, tracked her down to a small apartment 2 towns over that bore no resemblance to the 100-acre property her grandmother had once owned. They told her she owed back taxes, Clara said when we met her in her small kitchen, surrounded by photographs of the farm she had visited as a child. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook as she held the coffee cup, the tremor of someone who had been waiting a long time to tell this story. Thousands of dollars that she did not have. They showed her papers, official-looking documents, said she would lose everything if she did not pay immediately. The taxes were fabricated, Nolan said gently, sliding copies of the real records across her kitchen table. We have the documentation now. Your grandmother never owed anything. The notices were fake. The pressure was real, but the debt was not. Clara was quiet for a long moment, staring at the documents that proved what she had always suspected. Then she looked at me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She died believing she had failed her family, Clara said, that she had lost everything through her own mistake, her own stupidity, her own failure to understand complicated financial matters. She carried that shame for 15 years until the day she died. She apologized to me at the end, apologized for losing the farm that should have been my inheritance. My hand reached across the table and took hers, feeling the connection between us, the shared understanding of what it meant to have everything taken by people who knew the system better than you did. She did not fail, I said. She was deceived by people who were very good at deception, and now we are going to make sure everyone knows the truth. Clara became the first of 11 families to join our case. By the time the lawsuit was filed, we had gathered testimony from across 3 counties, grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the original victims, people who had spent decades wondering what had really happened to their family's land, who had always suspected that the official explanations did not add up. Each story was different. Each family had their own grief, their own anger, their own memories of what had been lost. But the pattern was always the same: vulnerable people, targeted when they were alone, pressured into signing documents they did not fully understand, stripped of everything while the Kessler family built their empire. But the most damaging discovery came when Nolan pulled legal records from 2008, documents that had been buried in archives for years, waiting to be found by someone who knew where to look. "There is a name here I think you should see," he said one afternoon, sliding a document across the table toward me, his expression carefully neutral in a way that told me the contents were significant. My eyes dropped to the signature at the bottom of the page. The familiar handwriting, those confident loops and precise lines that I had seen on birthday cards and Christmas letters, and the divorce papers that had ended my marriage. The name I knew as well as my own. Gordon Ashford. My ex-husband had been the attorney who reviewed and approved the final land transfers. He had signed off on documents that he must have known were fraudulent. He had helped Warren Kessler bury the evidence of what had been done. For 18 years, Gordon had been carrying that secret, and he had never said a word. Not while we were building what I thought was a life together. Not while he was telling me that I had contributed nothing of value. Not while he was taking everything and walking away. "He was paid," Nolan said quietly, pulling out another document, a financial record that showed numbers too large to be legitimate legal fees. "There are records of payments from Kessler Development to your husband's firm. Large payments, much larger than any standard fee for document review." Silence filled the room as I stared at Gordon's signature on the page, remembering all those years, all those nights when he had come home late claiming he was working hard for us, all those times he had told me that the money he made was his alone, that I had contributed nothing of value. He had built our life on lies, on corruption, on the suffering of people like Harriet Colvin, like Ruth Pemberton, like all those other women who had been stripped of everything they owned. And when I had become inconvenient, when I had served my purpose, he had discarded me just like he had helped Kessler discard everyone else. "We can use this," Nolan said. "It connects Kessler to criminal activity through a licensed attorney, and it connects your husband to conspiracy. This is the leverage we need." My eyes lifted to meet his. "Do it." The lawsuit was filed on a Tuesday morning in the county courthouse. By Wednesday, the local newspaper had picked up the story, running it on the front page with photographs of the properties that had been stolen and quotes from family members who had never given up hope for justice. By Thursday, regional news stations were covering the case, their vans parked on Winslow Street, their cameras filming the house where the evidence had been hidden for decades. By Friday, Warren Kessler had hired a team of attorneys from Cleveland, the most expensive and aggressive legal minds money could buy, to make the whole thing go away. But the story had already spread too far to be contained. Too many people knew. Too many voices were speaking. Too many families had come forward with their own experiences, their own documentation, their own memories of what had been taken from them. The 12 families became a community united by shared injustice. Scattered survivors who had never known they were connected, who had lived for decades believing their losses were isolated incidents, suddenly understood that they were part of something larger, something systematic, something that could finally be fought. Kessler fought back hard, as we knew he would. His lawyers filed motions to dismiss, claiming the statute of limitations had expired. They questioned the authenticity of Harriet's documents, hired handwriting experts who testified that the signatures might have been forged. They painted me as a confused, bitter woman who had been manipulated by a young attorney looking to make a name for himself, who had latched onto a conspiracy theory to give meaning to her empty post-divorce life. And Gordon tried one final intervention. He appeared at my house unannounced on a morning when I was preparing for a meeting with Nolan, his face pale and drawn in a way I had never seen before. His expensive suit slightly rumpled as if he had slept in it. "Vivian," he said, his voice carrying a tone I had never heard from him, something that might have been desperation. "You need to stop this. Now. Before it goes any further." "Why? Because it is going to destroy you along with Kessler?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice even though there was no one around to hear. "I am trying to help you. I am trying to save you from making the biggest mistake of your life. If you keep pushing this, they are going to dig into everything. Your finances, your mental health, every questionable decision you have ever made. They are going to find ways to make you look like a crazy woman who cannot accept her divorce, who is seeking revenge through any means available. And what about you, Gordon? What will they find when they dig into your involvement? When they trace those payments from Kessler Development to your firm? When they connect your signature to documents that were used to steal land from vulnerable people?" Silence stretched between us, filled with years of things unsaid. "You signed those documents," I said, keeping my voice steady even though my heart was racing. "You helped them steal from those people. You took money to look the other way. And then you came home to me, year after year, and pretended to be an honest man who had earned everything he had through hard work." "I did what I had to do," he said, and his voice had lost its confidence, its certainty. "Kessler was powerful, is powerful. I did not have a choice." "There is always a choice. You just made the wrong one." He left without another word, walking back to his car with his shoulders hunched, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. And watching him go, I knew that whatever connection we had once shared, whatever partnership we had built over 32 years of marriage, was truly and finally gone. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Every day I sat in that courtroom watching the proceedings unfold, watching the truth finally emerge into the light after decades of darkness. The wood-paneled walls seemed to absorb the weight of the testimony. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with that constant electric buzz. The judge sat on the elevated bench, her expression carefully neutral, her attention focused on every word. Kessler's attorneys were as good as money could buy. Expensive, experienced, skilled at creating doubt, at twisting facts, at making complicated things seem simple, and simple things seem impossibly complicated. They objected constantly. They challenged every piece of evidence. They made speeches about the presumption of innocence and the unreliability of decades-old documents. But Nolan was better. He presented the evidence methodically, building the case piece by piece like a master craftsman building a house, document by document, witness by witness. Each piece of evidence connected to the next, each testimony building on what came before. He called Clara Pemberton to the stand, and she told the story of her grandmother with a quiet dignity that silenced the courtroom. Her voice did not waver as she described the shame Ruth had carried, the apologies she had made, the belief that had haunted her until her death that she had failed her family. He called 3 other family members, each with their own story, each adding another weight to the scales of justice. An elderly man whose mother had lost her farm in 1985. A middle-aged woman whose grandmother had been pressured into selling a property that was now worth millions. A young woman who had grown up hearing stories about the land that should have been her inheritance. And then he called me. The witness stand felt exposed, vulnerable. Every eye in the courtroom fixed on me as I raised my right hand and swore to tell the truth. The truth that I had finally found. The truth that had been waiting for someone to discover it. Nolan walked me through everything. How I had found the house, the documents beneath the floor, the letter addressed to whoever finally stayed, the connections I had uncovered, one by one, until the full picture emerged of what had been done and who had been responsible. Then Kessler's lead attorney cross-examined me. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, his voice carrying the smooth condescension of someone who was very good at making witnesses look foolish. "Is it not true that you purchased this property just 3 weeks after your divorce was finalized?" "Yes." "And is it not true that you had no prior experience in real estate law, property research, or legal investigation of any kind?" "That is correct." "So you are asking this court to believe that you, a woman with no relevant expertise, no legal training, no background in investigation, stumbled upon evidence that professional investigators and attorneys missed for 40 years. Evidence that was supposedly right under everyone's noses, waiting to be found?" Silence stretched through the courtroom. I could feel the weight of every eye, the pressure of the moment, the importance of what I said next. "I am asking this court to believe the documents," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I am asking them to believe the witnesses who have come forward. I am asking them to believe the pattern that anyone can see if they bother to look at the evidence without prejudice. But why should they believe you? A woman who was just abandoned by her husband? A woman with obvious motivation to seek revenge? A woman who, by her own admission, has no expertise in any of the matters she claims to have uncovered?" I looked at the attorney, then at Kessler sitting at the defense table, then at the faces of the family members who had come to witness this moment. "Because I stayed," I said. "When everyone else walked away from that house, from those documents, from the truth that was too inconvenient to acknowledge, I stayed, and I kept looking. I refused to stop looking, even when powerful people tried to intimidate me, even when my own daughter warned me to give up, even when everyone told me I was wasting my time." I paused, letting the words settle. That is all I did. I refused to stop looking, and sometimes that is enough. The attorney had no follow-up questions. On the final day of testimony, Warren Kessler took the stand. He looked older than he had when he visited my house all those months ago, when he had offered me $50,000 to walk away. Smaller somehow. The confidence that had radiated from him like heat from a furnace had dimmed. He answered questions in short, clipped sentences, his eyes rarely meeting anyone else's, his expensive suit seeming too large for his shrunken frame. His attorneys tried to paint him as a legitimate businessman who had made good faith purchases from willing sellers, who had simply seen opportunities where others had not, who had built his success through hard work and vision rather than theft and intimidation. But Nolan had the records, the payments, the threatening letters that had been sent to vulnerable widows, the false tax documents that had been used to pressure desperate people into signing away their land, the testimony of people who had been there, who remembered what had really happened. When the evidence of the fabricated tax liens was presented, documentary proof that the Kessler family had created false government documents to steal property, Warren Kessler's face went pale beneath its artificial tan. "Did you authorize your employees to create false documents claiming that Ruth Pemberton owed back taxes?" Nolan asked. "I do not recall," Kessler said. "Did you authorize similar tactics with the other 11 families who have come forward in this case?" "I do not recall." "Mr. Kessler, do you recall anything about the systematic acquisition of properties from elderly women living alone over a 40-year period? Properties that are now worth millions of dollars? Properties that were taken through fraud and intimidation?" Kessler's attorney objected, calling the question argumentative. The judge overruled. "I do not recall," Kessler said again, but his voice had gone hollow, empty, the voice of a man who had run out of lies. The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon, after the jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts of fraud, liable for damages to all 12 affected families. The total amount was substantial, enough to change lives, enough to provide for grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the original victims, enough to acknowledge finally that what had been done was wrong, and that justice, however delayed, was still justice. Warren Kessler sat motionless as the verdict was read, his expression blank, his eyes fixed on something only he could see. His attorneys whispered urgently to him about appeals and motions and strategies for reducing the damages, but he did not respond. He just sat there, a man whose empire had been built on the stolen land, watching it crumble around him. After the proceedings ended, he walked out of the courtroom slowly, like a man who had aged decades in the span of hours. His driver was waiting outside with the expensive car, but Kessler paused on the courthouse steps, looking up at the autumn sky as if seeing it for the first time. He never looked at me, not once, not during the trial, not during the verdict, not as he walked away from the courthouse where his crimes had finally been exposed. 6 months later, Kessler Development filed for bankruptcy. The commercial properties were sold off piece by piece, the shopping centers and office parks and subdivisions finding new owners who would never know the blood and tears that had been built into their foundations. The empire that had taken 40 years to build collapsed in a matter of months. Warren Kessler moved to Florida, to a small condominium that bore no resemblance to the mansion he had once owned. His children, embarrassed by the scandal, stopped returning his calls. His grandchildren grew up not knowing his name. And Gordon Ashford, my ex-husband of 32 years, faced his own reckoning. No criminal charges were filed against him. The statute of limitations had expired on most of what he had done, and the rest fell into gray areas that prosecutors did not want to navigate. But his law license was permanently revoked, taken away by the same board that had granted it decades ago. His name appeared in the newspaper alongside Kessler's, linked forever to a scandal that would define how people remembered him. The colleagues who had respected him now avoided his calls. The clients who had trusted him with their legal matters found other attorneys. The reputation he had built so carefully over decades of practice was destroyed in a matter of weeks. Celia told me later, in a conversation that was awkward and painful for both of us, that he had moved to a small apartment in another state, that he spent most of his time alone, that the life he had built so carefully, the empire of credentials and connections and carefully cultivated respect, had collapsed around him just as completely as he had once collapsed mine. He had made choices, and now he was living with the consequences of those choices. That was not revenge. I took no pleasure in his suffering, but it was truth, finally exposed to the light. And sometimes truth is the only justice that really matters. Do you believe in justice? Not the kind that comes quickly or easily, not the kind that appears in television dramas where everything is resolved in an hour, but the real kind, the kind that you have to fight for, year after year, when everyone tells you to give up. The kind that requires patience and persistence and the willingness to stay when everyone else walks away. I did not believe in it for a long time. I spent decades living a life that was built on lies, trusting people who did not deserve my trust. But sitting in that courtroom, hearing those words, watching the truth finally emerge after 40 years of darkness, I understood something that had eluded me my whole life. Some things are worth fighting for, even when you fight alone, even when the odds are against you, even when powerful people try to silence you. If this story has touched something in you, leave a comment. Tell me about a time when you refused to give up, even when the world told you to quit. Tell me about the battles you have fought and the truths you have uncovered and the moments when staying made all the difference. 8 months after signing the papers to buy the ugliest house on Winslow Street, I stood on a porch that no longer creaked and looked out at a life I had never imagined. The house had been transformed, not into something grand or impressive, not into the kind of place that would appear in magazines or draw envious looks from strangers, but into something solid, something cared for, something that reflected the person who had refused to walk away from it. The paint was fresh, soft gray with white trim, colors I had chosen after weeks of studying samples and imagining how they would look in different lights. The windows were new, letting in morning sun that fell across floors I had sanded and refinished with my own hands, learning as I went, making mistakes and fixing them, building skills I had never thought I would need. The roof stood straight and strong, no longer sagging under the weight of decades of neglect. The porch no longer groaned beneath my feet. The yard was still a work in progress, but then again, so was I. The worst of the overgrown wilderness had been tamed, replaced by flower beds that were beginning to show signs of life, by a lawn that was slowly becoming green and even, by a garden where I was learning to grow vegetables. There was more to do. There would always be more to do. But that was all right. That was the nature of things worth caring about. Bennett sat on the porch steps, as he often did now, a cup of coffee in his weathered hands, the morning light catching the gray in his hair. He had become something I had not expected when I first saw him watching me from his porch all those months ago. Not a romantic interest, though there was affection between us, but something equally rare and perhaps more valuable. A friend, a real one. The kind who showed up when you needed them and did not keep score, who helped without being asked and listened without judgment. "Looks good," he said, nodding toward the house he had helped me repair. "Better every time I see it. It is getting there." His smile appeared, crinkling the corners of eyes that had seen a lot of life. "You said that 6 months ago. You will probably say it 6 months from now. And I will probably still mean it." The step beside him became my seat, the wood warm from the autumn sun. Some things take time. Some things are never really finished. We drank our coffee in comfortable silence, the kind that does not need to be filled with words, the kind that exists between people who have learned to trust each other through actions rather than promises. "Nolan stopped by yesterday," Bennett mentioned. "Wanted me to tell you the appeals process is moving forward, but he is confident. The evidence is too strong for Kessler's lawyers to overcome." He called me too, explained everything in that patient way he has, like he is still practicing how to talk to people who did not go to law school. Bennett chuckled. "He is a good kid. His aunt would be proud of what he has become, what he is doing with the education she encouraged him to get." A nod was my only response, but I felt the truth of his words. Nolan had opened a small office in town after the trial, working from a converted storefront on Main Street, specializing in cases that bigger firms would not touch. People who had been cheated by predatory lenders, families fighting unfair evictions, the kind of work that did not pay well but mattered deeply. He stopped by the house sometimes just to check in, to update me on the case, or to share memories of his aunt that he had not told anyone else, or simply to sit on the porch and talk about nothing in particular. He had become part of this place too, part of whatever this new life was becoming. Celia called 2 weeks after the trial ended. The phone almost went unanswered. We had not spoken since the day she came to warn me off, to protect her father from the consequences of his own actions. The relationship between us felt broken in ways that might never fully heal, but something made me pick up, some instinct that this time might be different. "Mom," she said, and her voice was unlike anything I had heard from her since she was a small child. Uncertain, humble, stripped of the confidence she had inherited from her father. "I need to talk to you." "Then talk." A long pause. Her breathing was audible on the other end of the line, the sound of someone gathering courage. "I did not know," she said finally, "about what Dad did, about the land and the families and the lies he told for all those years. I believed him when he said you were having a breakdown, when he said you were obsessing over conspiracy theories, when he said the divorce had pushed you over the edge." She swallowed hard. "I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because believing you would have meant admitting that everything I thought I knew about my family was wrong." Silence stretched between us, filled with years of things that should have been said differently. "What do you want, Celia?" Another pause. "I want to see you. I want to understand what happened. Why you stayed in that house when everyone told you to leave. Why you fought so hard for something everyone said was worthless. Why you believed in justice when everyone said it was impossible." My eyes moved around the room that had become my home, the room where I had found Harriet's box, the room where I had read her letter for the first time and decided I was not going to run, the room where I had learned that I was stronger than anyone, including myself, had ever given me credit for. "Come and see," I said, "and I will try to explain." She came the following weekend, driving the same car she had driven away in all those months ago, looking different when she stepped out onto the sidewalk. Older maybe, though only a few months had passed, or just more uncertain, more aware of how little she actually knew about the world and the people in it. The house was shown to her room by room, the repairs that had been made, the documents that had been found, the letter Harriet had written to whoever finally stayed, the photographs of the families who had been victimized, the stories of what had been taken from them, the evidence that had been hidden for decades in the floor beneath our feet. And the truth was told, all of it, without softening or omissions, about her father, about the choices he had made and the money he had taken, about the people he had helped to cheat and the lies he had told, about the life we had all been living on a foundation of corruption and stolen land. Celia cried, not the controlled, dignified tears of an adult managing her emotions, but the deep, raw sobs of someone whose world had been shattered. I sat with her while she processed it, not offering comfort exactly, but not withdrawing either. Just present. Just there. I am sorry, she said when she could speak again, for not believing you, for taking his side, for treating you like you were the problem when you were the only one telling the truth. You did what you thought was right. We all do. We make choices based on what we know at the time, based on who we trust, based on the stories we have been told about the world and ourselves. But you were right, she said. You were right all along, and I called you crazy. I sided with the person who was lying. My head shook. I was not right. I was just stubborn. I refused to stop looking for the truth, even when finding it was hard, even when it hurt. That is not the same as being right. That is just being unwilling to give up. She stayed for dinner that night, eating at the small table in the dining room, talking about everything and nothing, feeling our way towards something that might eventually become a real relationship again. Not the relationship we had before, when I was the dependent mother and she was the successful daughter. Something different. Something built on honesty rather than assumptions. It would take time. Trust, once broken, is not easily rebuilt. But the door was open now, held open by truth rather than propped up by convenient lies. And that was more than I had expected when I first signed the papers for a $3 house. Harriet's letter still lived in my drawer, tucked away with other treasures that had no monetary value but meant everything to me. The paper was more fragile now, soft at the edges from being handled, from being read and reread on nights when I needed to remember why I had stayed. To whoever finally stays. She occupied my thoughts often, this woman I had never met, this kindred spirit who had lived alone in this house for decades, who had known a terrible truth and had no one to share it with, who had hidden her evidence and waited for someone who would not be afraid to bring it to light. She had believed that someday someone would come along who would not walk away, someone who would see the value in something everyone else had dismissed, someone who would stay when staying was hard, when it was dangerous, when it seemed foolish and pointless and certain to fail. She had been right, and I wondered sometimes if she was aware of it, wherever she was now. If she knew that her patience had been rewarded, that her evidence had been found, that the truth she had protected had finally been told. The woman who had signed those papers for $3 8 months ago seemed like a stranger now. That woman had been lost, broken by betrayal and divorce, and the sudden destruction of everything she thought defined her. She had walked into this house with nothing but a suitcase and a desperate need to find something, anything, that belonged to her. But standing in this house now, looking out the window at the street where I had chosen to make my home, understanding came clearly. I had never needed what Gordon gave me. I had never needed his name on the deed, or his money in the bank account, or his approval of the choices I made. I had never needed to be Mrs. Ashford, wife of a successful attorney, mother to his daughter, keeper of his comfortable home. I had only needed the chance to prove what I was capable of when no one expected anything from me. The chance to be tested and to find that I was stronger than I knew. The chance to fight for something that mattered and to discover that I could win. This house had given me that chance, and I had taken it. Evening light fell soft through the windows I had cleaned and the frames I had painted, casting long shadows across the floors I had restored. A cup of coffee warmed my hands as I sat on the porch, watching the sky turn colors I had never paid attention to when I was busy being someone else's wife. Orange and pink and purple, shifting slowly as the sun dropped below the horizon, painting the clouds with light that would not last, but was beautiful while it existed. Bennett had gone home hours ago, back to the house 2 doors down where he had lived for 15 years and would probably live for the rest of his life. Nolan had called to give an update on the legal proceedings, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who knew he was on the right side of history. The street was quiet now, the way small towns get quiet when the day is ending, when families gather around dinner tables and children are called inside, and the world settles into the peace that comes before sleep. My thoughts turned to everything that had been lost in the past year. The home I had lived in for 3 decades, now belonging to someone else, holding memories I would never revisit. The business I had helped build, now being run by strangers who did not know its history. The marriage I had believed was solid, now dissolved into legal documents and bitter memories. The relationship with my daughter, fractured and slowly, carefully being rebuilt. And then my thoughts turned to what had been gained. A house that no one else wanted, transformed through labor and love into something beautiful. A truth that had been buried for 40 years, finally brought to light. A community of people who had been wronged and who had found their voice. A friendship with a man who asked nothing and gave everything. A relationship with my daughter that was beginning anew on a foundation of honesty. A sense of myself that I had never known before. An understanding of my own strength that no one could take away. For 54 years, I had lived according to other people's expectations, done what I was supposed to do, accepted what I was told I deserved, never questioned whether the life I was living was really mine, whether the person I was being was the person I wanted to be. But this life was mine, this house, this fight, this stubborn refusal to walk away from something that mattered, this willingness to stay when everyone else left. All of it had been found in the ugliest house on the street, in the documents of a woman who had died alone, in the $3 price tag that everyone else had laughed at, in the letter addressed to whoever finally stayed. I would not trade it for anything, not for money, not for comfort, not for the easy path that I could have taken, the $50,000 that could have bought me a quiet life somewhere far from here. The yard stretched out before me in the fading light, the garden I was learning to tend, the flowers that were beginning to bloom, the street where my neighbors had learned to respect me, where people waved as they walked their dogs or drove home from work, the sky that was darkening into evening, filling with stars that had been there all along, waiting to be noticed. And the words that had started everything came back to me once more, as they did every evening when I sat on this porch and thought about how far I had come. To whoever finally stays. I had stayed, and in staying I had finally found the place where I belonged. Thank you for staying with me through this entire journey. I know it was long. I know there were moments when the path seemed dark and the obstacles seemed impossible. But you stayed, just like I stayed, and for that I am grateful. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of your own struggles, or gave you hope for your own future, I would be so grateful if you would subscribe to this channel. We share stories here about hope, about second chances, about finding strength in places no one expected to look. Stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Stories about refusing to give up when the world tells you to quit. And I want to hear from you. Your story matters too. Have you ever found your place in something everyone else gave up on? Have you ever discovered that the thing no one wanted, the thing everyone dismissed as worthless, was exactly what you needed? Have you ever stayed when staying was hard, when it hurt, when everyone told you to leave? Leave your story in the comments. Share your experience. You never know who might be reading, who might need to hear exactly what you have to say, who might find courage in your words just as you found courage in mine. Until next time, take care of yourself. Be kind to yourself. And remember, sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in the places everyone else has forgotten. Sometimes the most valuable things in life are the ones that nobody else wanted. And sometimes, just sometimes, staying is the bravest thing you can do.